comments?
Yes.
You don't feel that that impacts your neutrality in this case?
No, not when it comes to looking at an internal affairs investigation, and being able to kind of pick it apart to determine if procedures and interviews were done correctly. I wasn't looking at it from a victim standpoint at all.
Presumably, as a police officer, you testified in many court proceedings throughout your career, is that correct?
Yes.
Can you recall ever testifying or hearing about any court case in which the victim was also an expert witness in the case? Your report includes mention of your personal sexuality. Is there a reason that you felt that that was important to include in the report?
Yes, because Chief Slavens' comments in the meeting that I was not in attendance of were directly against the protected class in the child
So, in part, that helps you identify yourself in the report as a victim?
Yeah, in part, that is putting me in that. He said something against who I am, and I think that takes me away from his comment. I don't feel that I'm a victim of Chief Slavin, but I feel that I was a victim of the comment that he made.
There were some questions earlier in this proceeding regarding how someone could possibly be targeted by comments about a person in a protected class, and that someone might be targeted even if they're not present in the room, just because of the nature of the comment and put that out. Do you believe that Chief Slavin, with his comments regarding sexuality in that meeting, do you think he was targeting you even though you weren't there?
I'm not sure.
I think it's a possibility.
Yes.
Do you believe that Chief Slavin has any animus toward anyone with any kind of sexuality? And let me strike that as a bad question. Do you believe that Chief Slavin has any animus toward anyone whose sexuality makes them part of a protected class?
Sorry, I didn't that one.
Okay. And I think I asked it badly again, so third time's the charm. Do you think that Chief Slavin, in your experience dealing with him, is homophobic?
I don't know. Honestly, for somebody to joke like that, for me, it means that they probably are. So, but in my opinion, making a joke like that, you don't make jokes like that unless you have an issue with that protected class.
And is that opinion based on anything else other than that joke?
That is the only instance that I know of that involved Chief Slavin. Thank you.
One of the areas of cross-examination for an expert in a case is to explore potential bias. And to that end, I have some questions about your interactions with certain members of the department. So that is the reason for the questions. Do you recall involvement in an incident where a drunk person hijacked a golf cart and led police on a pursuit?
Yes, ma'am.
You were involved in that case?
Yes, it was.
And you're aware that at some point, the department decided to refer at least one of the officers for a potential criminal prosecution, is that right?
Correct.
And you were not one referred for criminal prosecution, were you? Okay. Do you have an understanding of whose decision it was to refer one of the officers to a criminal investigation?
I believe that the decision, I know Chief Pop was out of town that week, so it was not him. I believe that a decision was made by Chief Slavin brought it forward, from what I know, to Chief Rodwell, and that's when that decision was made.
And hear sometimes about the rumor mill, and my understanding is that the rumor mill says that it was Chief Slavin who made that decision to refer officers for potential criminal consequences. Is that right?
That's what I heard as well.
You mentioned that Sergeant Lewis was your potential, Sergeant Lewis was your former partner, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
After you left Internal Affairs, the golf cart incident in which you were involved was referred for an Internal Affairs investigation, is that right?
That's correct.
And Sergeant Lewis, your former partner, investigated you, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Allegations were made against you that you failed to properly supervise a pursuit, is that correct?
Yes.
Sergeant Lewis's investigation found that you were the ranking officer on scene of that pursuit, is that correct? His investigation revealed that an unarmed man in the process of surrendering was both shot and bit by a dog with a non-lethal wound.
I'm going to disagree with the part where you said he was in the process of surrendering, but yes, that is part of the rest of it is accurate.
You don't believe that the gentleman was in the process of surrendering? Okay. At the time that he was shot, had he exited the golf cart?
At the time that he was hit with the less lethal rounds, I believe he was out of the golf cart.
And thank you for that clarification. Did he exit the golf cart with his hands up?
I wasn't in a position to observe that. I was about 3 or 4 vehicles behind him.
Sergeant Lewis's investigation revealed that while the suspect was still being bit by the canine, that you were caught on body camera laughing. Is that correct?
I don't believe that I was laughing.
You don't believe that
I don't remember laughing at all.
Were you angry about that investigation?
No, never.
Do you think that investigation was fair to have done, first off?
Yes, of course.
Do you think that Sergeant Lewis treated you fairly in the course of that investigation?
Yes, he did.
Have you ever criticized Sergeant Lewis for any of his decisions or practices in the investigation of you?
I did not.
You have never criticized Sergeant Lewis for any of his participation in that investigation?
No, ma'am.
Have you ever talked to anyone from POSA about that investigation?
Don't recall. I may have talked to Damien Mendoza about it, but I don't remember.
Are you a member of POSA?
Yes, I am.
Are you familiar with an email message about your case that POSA sent to a large number of members?
I believe Damien sent out an email. I don't remember exactly what it read, because he has sent out several emails over the last year and a half.
About the golf cart case?
Yes.
About you?
Oh, no, I believe that there's been several emails. I just don't specifically recall the one that you're speaking of.
You don't, did you receive a copy of that email?
Related to this? No.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you receive a copy of an email that POSA sent to its members regarding the golf cart case and your participation in it?
I probably did. What I'm trying to say is I just don't remember what it said.
Okay, and I wasn't asking that. Just, you were copied on the email that mentioned you.
Okay, sure. Yes.
You recall that?
Yes.
Okay. Do you recall that there was an attachment to that email of 11 pages describing some faults and flaws that POSA had with the handling of dog bite incident?
I don't remember that. I don't remember the attachment.
Are you saying that didn't happen?
No, I don't remember if it happened or not. This is gotta be a year and a half ago at this point.
Okay. And I'm referring to an email that was, let me ask if there was an email sent in January of this year that you were copied on from POSA to its members, and the subject of the email was you.
I don't remember seeing that, actually. I may have gotten it. As I said, I retired in January, so I just don't remember the exact email.
Are you still a member of POSA?
Yes.
When in January did you retire?
I believe my last day was the 31st.
As a result of the internal affairs investigation into your supervision of the scene, did you receive a letter of reprimand?
Yes, I did.
And in fact, the allegations against you were found to be sustained by Sergeant Lewis. Is that correct?
Correct.
Do you agree with that determination?
Yes and no.
Well, I'll ask again. Sergeant Lewis's conclusion in that investigation was that you had a sustained violation of failure to properly supervise. Is that correct?
Correct.
Do you agree with that finding?
No, actually, I don't.
Do you recall when you received the letter of reprimand?
I believe it was in December of 2019, or late November.
So you retired approximately 1 month after receiving the written reprimand?
I don't know the date, might be 2 months later, but yeah.
Had you planned on retiring before you received that letter of reprimand?
Yes.
Do you agree with Chief Rodwell's decision to issue you a letter of reprimand?
Do I agree with it? I don't agree with the sustained violation of failure to supervise. So if that means that I don't agree with the issuing of the letter of reprimand, then I don't agree with that in that as well.
Do you consider yourself to be personal friends with Commander Minor?
Yes.
How long have you known Commander Minor?
I probably knew him starting in about 2001, 2002. We didn't really become friendly until I promoted to sergeant, and he was my training officer as a sergeant, so that would be in 2007.
He was your supervisor?
He was my training, sergeant training FTO, or field training officer, or sergeant.
Okay. And I'm sorry, I might not have heard. How many years have you been friends with Commander Minor?
I would say friends, probably about 13 years.
Do you have an understanding of whether Commander Minor felt through his participation in the 2 IAs that he was acting to protect you?
No, I think he was out to do what was right. And if in the course of doing what was right was actually protecting me and protecting the people of my gender and my class, then that's an ancillary consequence. But I do believe that he was doing the right thing by bringing it forward.
You don't think that he was acting in any way specifically to protect you personally?
No, I think that he was, had it been a comment against, a racially biased comment, I think, against another protected class, I believe that he would have done the same thing. So I don't think it was specifically related to me and my sexual orientation.
There are some notebooks on the book in front of, on the desk in front of you. If you could refer to notebook 1 and 2, please. There are Bates numbers in the bottom right corner, and I'll direct you to page 2214 in City Exhibit 1.
Which section?
I think it's section 1. They're all chronologically paginated, so we can go by page numbers as well. But page 2214. Document before?
Yes, ma'am.
That's part of the record that you reviewed?
Yes, ma'am.
Would you like to make any revisions to your prior testimony?
Are you asking me if I feel that he was protecting me? Is that what you're asking, if I want to revise that statement? Because I'm very confused with what it is that you're trying to gather.
I'll back up. I'll refer you to the last bullet point on that page, and this is a document submitted by Commander Minor. Quote, "In my mind, I was standing up for her, even though she never asked me to do so. Who else in the department considered her perspective? Was she briefed? Did she receive an apology?" And that's your name on that page, is it not?
Yes. You asked me if I felt that he was trying to protect me, and I'm sorry, the semantics of that is different for me than standing up for somebody. So if you're standing up for somebody of a protected class or somebody that you feel is being discriminated against, doesn't necessarily mean you're trying to protect them. So I apologize that that was confusing. But yes, he was standing up for me, and in my mind, for all people of my sexual orientation.
Thank you. I appreciate you clarifying the ambiguity of my question. I'd like to talk now about some of your opinions in this case. You answered questions from Mr. Servalik about sometimes people make a mistake, sometimes people lie.
Yes.
As a police officer and former internal affairs investigator, have you had occasion to evaluate whether people were telling you the truth or not?
Yes.
And presumably you evaluate the words that they say, correct?
Yes.
Do you also observe their body language, tone, inflection, and demeanor to assist you in determining whether the subject is lying to you?
Yes.
Did you have the opportunity to observe the demeanor, body language, tone, or inflection of Commander Minor's interview with Sergeant Lewis?
Tone based on the audio recordings, but other than that, no.
Based on the audio recording that you heard, was there any indicia of truthfulness, in your opinion, in Commander Minor's tone?
I couldn't tell you. I mean, I would be telling the truth. I don't know what truth sounds like other than somebody stating the facts.
I'll move on. One of your opinions in this case involves the use of open-ended questions or closed-ended questions. Fair to say that that's a major part of your concern about the investigation in this case?
It's a concern for the initial interview. For the interviews of Chief Slavin and Chief Slavin and Commander Minor.
Are there circumstances when open-ended questions would be more appropriate?
Yes, if you're trying to get somebody to tell you a story about an incident that may have occurred, for instance, the pursuit that I was involved in, I was asked more open-ended questions because I needed to tell the story from the beginning until the end. And at that point, once that person has given you that explanation or that story, you can then ask more direct, closed-ended questions to clear up anything that you may not have worked with them.
So open-ended questions are better for getting the story, and closed-ended questions are better for pinning it down. Is that a fair characterization?
I would just.
Okay. And yet you criticized Sergeant Lewis for asking open-ended questions to his first fact-finding witness, who was Commander Minor, when Sergeant Lewis was trying to find out the story.
You talking about the initial internal affairs investigation?
I am.
Counsel, with respect to the objection, I don't think that's an accurate statement. This stated Minor was the second interview.
Correct. That's what I was.
Are you talking about?
I was talking about Commander Minor's first interview in the Slavin versus his second interview in his own investigation.
Okay,
Not the first.
interview in the Slavin investigation.
Correct.
That was- Okay.
Correct.
So which internal affairs investigation?
All right, I will back up to make sure we're clear.
Okay.
When Sergeant Lewis commenced the first investigation, the investigation into Chief Slavin, the very first person that he spoke with was Chief Slavin, who was the target of the investigation. Is that right?
That's correct.
And I believe you just told us that when you're trying to find out the story, that open-ended questions are better to ask. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. Do you have any criticisms of Sergeant Lewis for asking open-ended questions to Chief Slavin in that interview that he conducted?
I don't, but I don't.
Okay. And it sounds like you were wanting to say he probably should have asked some closed-ended questions at the end of it?
No, I was gonna criticize the fact that there was no fact-finding prior to that.
Okay, and we'll talk about that. So the first witness interview that Sergeant Lewis conducted in the Slavin investigation was Commander Minor. Do you
Correct.
agree?
Yes.
And in that interview with Commander Minor, Sergeant Lewis used open-ended questions. Do you agree with that?
He asked both, I would say, all types of questions.
Okay. Do you believe that Sergeant Lewis did anything inappropriate in asking open-ended questions to Commander Minor, who was his first witness in the investigation? Let's talk about your critique regarding fact-finding. In your opinion, what kind of fact-finding is required when an IA investigator first receives a case overall?
Usually, in an internal affairs investigation, prior to interviewing the subject of the investigation, you gather evidence, and it could be verbal testimony, or it could be written evidence, it could be, there's been internal investigations where there was data that was on a computer that we needed to look at first. But usually you have the facts of the investigation gathered prior to interviewing the subject of the investigation. And in this case, the way that would have been done would be by interviewing all of the witnesses first, which is typically how an internal affairs investigation is completed, is you interview the witnesses involved in the investigation first, and then the subject of the investigation, so that you have the correct questions to ask them related to the event that occurred.
Okay. Do you consider that a best practice?
That is a best practice.
Okay. Are there cases that you're familiar with where that hasn't happened?
The only time that might happen is if that person is the only witness or person related to that investigation, and I can give you an example where I had an employee who was out of county and got into an argument with somebody at a county facility in a different county, and they called to complain that he assaulted her. So that was all that I had. I didn't have any actual witnesses that were from the police department. I didn't have any witnesses other than that person's complaint. So the only person that I formally interviewed for that investigation was the involved officer.
Did that matter involve a crime scene specialist? Do you remember when you were an internal affairs investigator interviewing officers or conducting an investigation regarding a crime scene specialist who had made a crude comment about someone from the medical examiner's office?
Yes, I don't remember if I was the primary investigator on that. You might have that in front of you, but I'm not sure, but I do remember.
Do you have a recollection that the officer, that the subject officer in that case was interviewed first?
I don't have a recollection of that, I'm sorry. I don't remember if I was even the primary investigator on my case.
So we've talked about the interview with Chief Slavin, and it's your opinion that it is a best practice to do some fact-finding before you speak with the subject. You're aware that Internal Affairs did eventually follow up and re-interview Chief Slavin with more specific questions. Is that right?
I believe that was conducted 4 or 5 months later.
That was conducted, is that right?
That was conducted.
I'd like to ask you now about the interview with Commander Minor.
Okay.
Actually, I'll back up. You've criticized the drafting of the report, the fact that it's not in chronological order.
Yes, ma'am.
And you characterize that as misleading by Sergeant Lewis.
Yes.
You believe that's misleading?
I believe it's misleading because when you're writing an internal affairs summary, you write it in chronological order so that the reader can see who you interviewed in what order, in order to kind of make sense of the story and the events that occurred.
Anywhere in your review of the report, did Sergeant Lewis misstate the dates at all?
No, ma'am.
And if we go back through any investigations that you were involved with, would we find every single one of yours in chronological order?
I believe you would.
One of the criticisms that has been leveled in this case is that Internal Affairs should have spoken with you regarding the Slavin comments investigation. Do you share that criticism?
Yes.
Do you think you should have been interviewed?
Yes.
What should you have been asked?
I don't believe that it should matter whether or not a person is in the room to determine whether or not a statement is discriminatory. And there were people in the room that felt that the timing of his comment was in direct relation or directly after he spoke about the pursuit that I was the commanding officer of. So to segue from the pursuit into this homophobic comment, for me, there's a direct relation that this was being talked about, and then we start making fun of gay people. So yeah, I think I should have been interviewed. Regretfully, I wasn't there at that meeting that day.
What would you have told Internal Affairs had they spoken with you?
I would have said that those comments were extremely offensive. I would have said that I have lost faith in that person for being an assistant chief that I worked under. And I would have probably spoken to HR. I was not, I don't believe that it was a fair thing for him to say. And I'm not the only gay person that works for the Scottsdale Police Department. So it just so happens that they were talking about my pursuit, and it was a meeting that I technically should have been and usually would have been in attendance of.
Other than the fact that you were offended and the fact that you felt it might have some connection to you personally, is there any other information that you would have wanted to share with IA had they spoken with you?
Not that I can think of right now.
And would it be fair to say that, in your opinion, IA should have reached out to you because of the personal connection, but you would agree that if there is an offensive statement towards someone or towards a protected class, it is not appropriate for IA to go and find employees of that class and bring them in for interviews or single them out.
Correct. I think my justification for saying that I should have been interviewed was the fact that they had just been talking about me, and then literally moments later, he made a homophobic comment.
You've criticized attention to detail in the report.
Yes, ma'am.
Is it your opinion that any of the typos that you identified made any material difference to the outcome of the report?
No.
I want to ask you a few more questions about cases where a subject officer might be interviewed first. You mentioned that you said it was only where there would be a single comment, or, let me back up. Can you remind me? I forgot. When would it be appropriate in your view to interview a subject officer first?
If, I would say there's probably a couple of situations. One would be if there were no witnesses related to that investigation. For instance, there have been times in the past where maybe there was, I'm trying to think of an actual situation, there was an employee who was being looked at for time theft, falsifying their timesheet. There's no witnesses to that to do that investigation, so the person that you're going to speak to is the involved party. You're going to speak to them first.
Do you recall investigating an incident in 2016 involving an officer's use of force, July 2016?
I investigated many cases of use of force, so I'm not sure specifically which one you're speaking about.
Okay. Do you recall a use of force incident where you interviewed a police aide first, who was a witness to the use of force? You don't recall that?
I don't recall the investigation, I'm sorry, unless you gave names that might help me.
Let's see what you do. Stanley?
Officer Stanley, yes, I remember that.
You remember that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Do you remember that the subject was a police aide that had involved an attempt to detain a juvenile?
The investigation was against Officer Stanley, and I don't remember who I interviewed first in that investigation.
Would it have been a violation of internal affairs investigator best practices to have conducted the subject interview in that case first?
No, there's no, like I said, it's best practice, doesn't mean that it's all the time. But, you know, it's, I would say 99% of the time that's how you do it. I don't know if I knew that, police aide, I think it was Hernandez, was he the police aide involved, maybe? I don't know if I knew that he was there at the time. This is a very long time ago, I'm trying to remember the best that I can.
I'll ask you another one. Do you remember an internal affairs investigation on which you worked involving an officer-involved shooting regarding Officer Bailey, 2016?
Yes,
What was your role in that investigation?
I was assisting on that one, I believe.
Okay. Do you have an understanding of of whether the interview with the subject officer occurred first in that case?
I don't know, I was not the primary investigator.
You're here today as an expert witness to talk about standards and practices for investigations. Is it your opinion that in that case, the facts of which are familiar to you, that it would have been a violation of best practices to interview the subject officer first?
I'm going to object. It actually misstates the evidence pretty strongly. If this involves an officer-involved shooting, the board should be aware that Internal Affairs doesn't conduct interviews of the officer-involved shooting at the scene. So there's a scene interview that's recorded, that's conducted. There's multiple witness interviews that are conducted at the scene that are recorded, and the Internal Affairs process doesn't even happen until months after the shooting happened. So I wasn't there for this instance, but I do represent officers and officer-involved shootings. So this is a factually distinct circumstance where it wouldn't have been the first interview conducted. The shooting would have had the other part.
I'll ask the witness, are officer-involved shootings investigated differently than other investigations, such as the one in this case?
Yes,
In what way?
there's a bifurcated investigation. First, there's a criminal investigation that is completed to make sure that the officer didn't commit a crime when shooting at whoever it was that they were
Okay, oh,
shooting.
because we raised that as one line, obviously, the officer has Fifth Amendment rights, is that correct?
Yes.
Objection, sustained.
I'll move on. There's been a lot of discussion in this case about violations of AR 333, Part 1, Part 2 violations. Do you have any criticism of Sergeant Lewis for finding that the comments by Assistant Chief Slavin should be sustained as an AR 333, Part 2 violation?
I believe it was, should have been founded as a Part 1 violation.
Do you have an understanding of what the legal ramifications would be if it was a Part 1 or a Part 2 with respect to the employee appeal rights?
So the discipline and the after effects of that?
Correct.
No.
Have you ever sustained an AR 333 Part 2 violation against someone who directed an offensive comment toward a member of a protected class?
I don't believe so, but I don't remember. I think they were part of the Part 1 violation.
Do you recall being an investigator in a case where a sergeant made comments about male anatomy and then told a female witness who was present, "Don't get me fired"? Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. That's the one case I spoke about earlier.
Okay. Was that a sustained Part 1 violation or a Part 2 violation?
I don't remember.
Okay. We have this one in your exhibits, so let's turn to that.
Can you just tell her? So, I mean, if you have more questions about it,
Okay.
it was done as a Part 2, it was done as a Part 2, and that's what you're trying to find. Because again, we've had this, we review them,
Okay.
move along, you know.
I'll let the board know, and again, this is for impeachment purposes on this expertise. Ms. Palopoli, the parties in this case have copies of investigations that you did regarding 2 separate incidents where police employees made comments that were offensive and directed targeted comments toward females who were present, "Don't get me fired." First off, were you the lead investigator on both of those investigations?
I was for sure on the first one involving the sergeant. Are you talking about both cases against the sergeant or the one that was against the officer?
Okay.
I don't know if I was the lead on the officer investigation. That may have been Sergeant Lewis. Again, this is years ago.
And I apologize, you probably have that in front of you for us to go through and start digging through. You said there was a comment directed to a female officer. Was the comment sexual, or was the comment just, I should say just, was the comment, "Don't tell anyone," or something like that? That's, could you tell us what the comment towards the female employee was?
Thank you, sir. I was trying to not say comments on the public
Whatever it
record.
was.
But I will tell you, in the exhibits to this case, the board has been given IA reports for 2 investigations. One against a sergeant who was talking about a truck giving him an erection, and then he told the sole female present, who was not really in the main group of men talking, "Don't get me fired."
Yes,
Were you the lead investigator in that investigation?
yes, I was.
Do you agree that the comment made by the sergeant in that case constituted an offensive remark directed at a member of a protected class?
No,
Do you believe that that incident in its totality, where both the comment regarding erections and the specific call out of the female employee and implied threat of "don't get me fired," that together could be considered an offensive comment toward a member of a protected class?
I don't think his comment to the female employee was in relation to her gender. I think it was, she was the odd person out in the room. She didn't belong there. She was visiting the briefing room that day. I think it was more of an intimidation to her, to not bring that comment forward. I don't believe that it was because she was female.
Do you believe that she was singled out because she was female?
I believe that she was singled out because she was the sole person in the room that did not belong, and she happened to be female.
Do you think that that incident, and we can let the report speak for itself, do you think that that incident should have been sustained as a Part 1 violation of AR 333?
You know, I would really love the opportunity to look back at that report at this point, because I don't want to speak to something if it was investigated as a Part 1 or Part 2. I would rather have that information up front than be guessing as to what I would believe it to be right now, 4 years later.
2 years later, but based on that statement from the witness, can I give her a minute to take a look?
Could you go to the next one if you want to address it?
I'm sorry?
Could you go to the next one to address it? I think you've got enough time to witness on that now.
Thank you. Ms. Palopoli, do you remember participating in an investigation of a officer who was a subordinate to the sergeant we were talking about the first one?
Yes.
Okay. Sergeant Lewis, who was your partner, was the lead investigator on that?
Yes.
You assisted him in that investigation, correct?
Correct.
The report was signed off on by both of you, is that correct?
If that's what you're telling me, then yes.
Okay. In that case, an officer was talking about vegan masturbation and made some graphic comments about that, and then also told a female witness, "Don't get me fired." Correct. Do you believe that that should have been sustained as a 333 Part 1 violation?
Again, there's no protected class being made fun of during that statement. So I believe that was done as a Part 2 violation. And no, I don't believe that that should have been Part 1. Vegans are not a protected class.
Women certainly are.
Yes, ma'am?
And the sole female in the room was singled
Well,
out.
counsel, comments about sex are protected. Women aren't different than men. Men can be sexually harassed also.
Fair enough. Ms. Palopoli, I will finally ask you about, do you believe that there was any violation of best practices or inappropriate behavior on the part of Sergeant Lewis when he decided to treat and, let me strike that and start over. I'll explain where I'm going and then ask the question just for time purposes. There has been some critique in this case of the fact that Commander Miner was interviewed as a witness, but then later on, when the discrepancy between Commander Miner's testimony and Lieutenant Monette's testimony came up, that this was opened as a new investigation into Commander Minor's integrity, as opposed to being handled within the confines of the Slavin investigation. Is that critique one that you share?
So what you're asking me is if it should have remained underneath Chief Slavin's investigation?
Right.
No, if there's an integrity, if there's a belief that there's an integrity violation, and this has happened to me before, where you could be doing an investigation on one party and a witness lies during that investigation, then you would start a new investigation for an integrity violation against that person. So it should be a different IA investigation. We have a different number.
Thank you. So you don't have any criticism of that aspect of this case?
No.
Those are all the questions I have. Thank you.
Cross-examination?
Yes, so, Ms. Palopoli, you were asked some questions on cross-examination about the order of witness interviews.
Sometimes speak out when I'm saying there's a redirect.
I
You
knew-
have 20 minutes, 25 minutes.
I knew what you meant, I got the finger point, so I was good to go anyway.
We need 10.
10? Okay, we need 10, so you have 15 minutes.
All right. I think I'll be able to accomplish that easily. So you asked some questions on cross-examination about the order of the interviews that occurred. And you talked about the best practice being to not interview the subject of the investigation first, correct?
Yes.
So I want to add some context to that. And tell me, is one of the reasons why you don't interview the subject first is because that can actually impact the notice of investigation?
Impact the notice of investigation against the person that's, the case is against?
Yeah.
Yeah.
For example, if witness officers that are in the room say, hey, this is a homophobic comment, there's multiple comments that were made, the email was something different, if you learn that as part of your investigation prior, that might actually impact your NOI that you give the subject, right?
Yes, because if that subject doesn't disclose that information or possibly states it in a different way, are they committing an integrity violation? Are they lying? It's one of those things that you kind of wait till you have all of your information first, and then you interview that person that is the subject of the investigation
Okay.
at the end.
I'm going to jump all over the place in my notes and for the purposes of being quick. You provided testimony on cross-examination that you're still a member of POSA. Is that because POSA provides a cell phone discount?
Yes.
Is there any other reason that you're a member of POSA besides the cell phone discount at this point? Does anything about your continued membership in POSA impact your ability to analyze an internal affairs report?
No.
You were asked some questions about evaluating when someone is telling you the truth as an investigator. Do you recall those questions?
Yes.
Is part of that evaluation as to whether someone's telling you the truth, trying to find motivation behind lying?
Yes.
Why is that important?
Usually a reason that somebody lies in an investigation. It's either to protect themselves or they're embarrassed by something that may have happened. Or, I mean, basically it's to protect themselves because they don't want to get in trouble.
But looking at motivation is something that internal affairs tries to resolve in integrity cases?
Yes.
Why?
In order to determine if somebody is lying, you are going to try to pick apart why they're lying to you. It's part of the investigation. It's something that is relevant to the entire case. And it could be simply that, they were having troubles at home and were unable to go to work that day, so they called in sick when they really weren't sick. Is that a lie? Technically, yeah, they're not sick, but yet so there's a motivation there, right? I don't really know if I'm answering your question correctly, Steve, but that's the way I think you're going.
That's fine. I'm going to move on to a completely different subject. the types of comments that we know were made here, either about a French commander, and then obviously about the question, are you gay? Do those type of comments require an investigation under AR 333? Or would the past practice of Scottsdale let this type of comment stop at an informal verbal counseling and no further fact-finding of what occurred?
That type of comment said in a public setting would be investigated.
Are you familiar with anything in the past practice of Scottsdale in your 20 years there that would have caused a comment like that to not be investigated under AR 333? Now, you were also asked questions at the very end of Cross about the integrity violation thing, and I want to provide some context for that. So, as internal affairs investigators at Scottsdale, before you write your report, do you review the transcripts and interviews that occurred in the investigation?
Yes.
Is one of the things that, if you saw material discrepancies between interviews, is that something that you would self-initiate to say, hey, we've got to find out what happened here?
Yes.
Why?
In fact, at the end of when you get your transcript, there's actually a signature box at the end of that transcript saying that you reviewed it for its accuracy. So if you're reviewing it for accuracy, you should also be reviewing it to determine whether or not somebody was being truthful in their statements. So if they weren't, you would bring that to light and inform the chiefs that, hey, I think somebody might have lied during the interview. Here's the place where I believe that they lied.
And is that something that Sergeant Lewis would have been expected to do as part of the standard practices for the Scottsdale Police Department Internal Affairs Unit?
Yes.
In this case, did Sergeant Lewis identify any discrepancies in his interview initially?
He did not.
Okay. Do you know if those same interviews are sent to Chief Rodbell for his review before finalization?
The entire investigation, including the transcripts, is provided to Chief Rodbell. So as far as I remember, he reads the transcripts as well as the summary of each internal affairs investigation.
Had you been called back to the chief's office when you were in internal affairs and other cases to answer questions about interviews or things that were or were not in investigations?
Yes. Do I remember specifically which cases? No.
Okay. That's all I have.
Does the vice chair have any questions?
He certainly does.
Thank you, please proceed.
Surprise, surprise. You're no longer a police officer, is that correct?
I think once you're a police officer, you're always a police officer, sir.
That's why you can't shake the shoes?
Yes.
Did you regularly attend the command meetings like the one that happened on May 9th?
Yes, I did.
Can you describe the general atmosphere of those command meetings?
They're usually very, they start off informal in terms of everybody's just kind of chatting and stuff, and then once they begin, normally there's a meeting sheet that goes over the agenda for that meeting. And for the most part, depending on who is running the meeting, it's usually run by either a commander or an assistant chief. And they go over the agenda. But it's pretty specific. They do the agenda, and then if there's any questions at the end, then we can ask questions. But other than that, there's not a whole lot of kidding around with banter once the meeting begins.
It's interesting because when I read through the transcripts of the different, I think 16 interviews, and there were 7 different versions because there were sidebars or there was too much noise, that I had the impression that they become somewhat chaotic and they're not well controlled, but you're describing something different.
Yeah, the ones that I had been in attendance of, they were more controlled than what it seems for that one.
Okay. When you were in IA, would you have grabbed someone on a Friday afternoon at 3:18 for an IA interview without them expecting it and knowing that the next day they're going to start a 2-week vacation?
No, typically, especially if they're a witness, you would give them the opportunity to schedule that interview with you. Usually there's an email communication or phone call that occurs to determine hey, when's the best time for you to come in and talk to us? It gives that person an opportunity to go over the story that's in their mind, there's typically not off the cuff interviews.
Says gather the thoughts.
Correct.
Thank you. Did you ever aspire to be a commander?
No,
No.
no, sir.
What went into your decision to retire?
A great job offer
Okay.
outside of the agency.
And it's going well?
Yes,
Congratulations.
thank you.
On a scale of 1 being low, 5 being high, how would you rate the competency of the first Lewis Minor interview on the 28th?
Unfortunately, for Joel, I would say that it was about a 2.
2. What would have made it a 5?
I would have scheduled that interview in advance and given Commander Minor an opportunity to gather his thoughts and plan of what it was that he remembers and what he needed to talk about. And I would have asked much more specific questions. Were you directly offended? That question still doesn't make sense to me to this day. I would have said, were you offended by that comment? And it just cleans it up. Or do you know anybody that was offended by that comment? Which I don't even think is Commander Minor's place to speak of. I think if you're planning to interview everybody that's involved in that investigation, then you're going to ask them all, were you offended by the comment that Chief Slater made? That's how you button that up real clean. Just ask everybody the same question across the board. That question was asked 7 different ways from somebody.
Former Commander Minor had no difficulty reporting to COP on the Tuesday following the Thursday meeting in comments regarding how he and Lieutenant Bonnet felt about it.
Yes.
Yet on the 28th, he seemed to be unwilling to offer that same information up. Can you maybe shed some light on that, since I assume you know both people fairly well?
It is my belief, you're talking about during his interview, he was not as forthcoming or
Yes.
he was unwilling.
Yes.
It is my belief that Sergeant Lewis's line of questioning was what led to a lot of confusion in Commander Minor's statements. I just feel that if he had asked him direct questions, were you offended, or were you offended? I think that would have just cleaned it up a lot better. And he didn't ask that. He was asking. It was just a very strange line of questioning to me. And I don't believe that I don't know if Chief Pop was interviewed during that first investigation. I don't believe that he was, but I would have interviewed him because Commander Minor went to him and
I believe you're correct in that.
brought forward the investigation.
Speaking for your fellow lieutenants when you were here on the force, is there anyone in leadership above lieutenant level that the lieutenants don't want to cross for fear of retaliation?
In my personal opinion, no.
Helpful, thank you.
Any follow-up, Mr. Sadovik?
Yeah, briefly. This relates to the context and the direction of questioning that you were asked by the vice chair. And I realize that I think I missed this the first time. Is there anything that would have prevented Chief Rodbell from informing internal affairs that Lieutenant Bonnet and Commander Minor had made complaints about the investigation, or about the statements that were made at the meeting?
No.
And in your experience at Scottsdale, you were asked a question, and I want to make sure that the wording wasn't confusing. Are people at the department worried about crossing Chief Rodbell?
there is some worry about that.
Why is that?
He's been around a long time, and there is a bit of a culture that if you cross, you asked, I apologize because you did ask me about the commanders, so at the chief level, if you cross the chiefs, that you're,
I meant to include anyone above the lieutenant
I
level.
understand now. Is my feeling and in my experience, what I've seen is if you cross anybody in the echelon of the chief's office, you're not gonna last very long with the police department. There have been a few people at or above my rank that are no longer with us based on an internal affairs investigation.
Okay, apologize. You mean chief apostrophe S or chief S?
The chief, I call the chief's office, but it ends with Chief Robinell.
Okay, so you're not talking about the assistant chiefs, you're just talking. Okay, I just wanted that clarification.
Two last questions, please.
Well, I don't think Mr. Savali finished. I was just trying to get clarification for you.
No, I appreciate that. And in this, the other part about the IA practices that I neglected to mention is that there's some evidence that after Commander Minor went off tape, there was a conversation that Commander Minor had with Sergeant Lewis that said, look, do you want to know about how this was reported? And do you want to know how Rodbell handled this? Because if you do, I'll go back on tape. As an investigator, is that something that you would have gone back on tape on, or that an investigator should go back on tape on?
Yes, especially if the witness has more information, you want to go back on tape and you want to have it recorded.
Has that happened to you before, where you've finished an interview and then either the witness or you has said, oh, hey, by the way, there's something else I want to tell you about, and you've gone back on tape?
Several times.
Okay. But as an investigator, if you don't want to give the answer, if you don't want to record it, then you might not go back on tape? Sorry, that's a poor question. I would draw that question. And is there anything in your experience where somebody would have reported inappropriate or gender-related comments up through their chain of command and they wouldn't have been investigated for 6 weeks?
Objective foundation, I don't think this witness
Well,
testified.
we know how long the time between the act and the investigation. That's overruled. Go ahead.
So,
No.
so what would the normal process be if someone comes forward and says, I heard inappropriate, offensive comments made at a command staff meeting?
That investigation would be initiated almost immediately.
Okay, thank you.
Additional requests from you, based upon what was asked by
Yes, thank you. Ms. Palopoli, you talked about a better practice for an investigator to be to ask direct questions so that you can button things up. Is that right?
Yes.
You rated Sergeant Lewis's interview was a 2 out of 5 because he didn't button things up. Is that right?
Yes.
Did it look like Sergeant Lewis was on a fishing expedition to you?
No.
How would you rate Commander Minor's performance in that interview on that same 1 to 5 scale?
5 was the, remind me of what your scale,
1 was low, 5 was high?
for what was the terminology that you used to,
1 was low, 5 was high.
no, I'm looking for the word.
Competency?
Yes, thank you. I would rate Commander Minor at a 4.5. I think that he had some confusion in the line of questioning that Sergeant Lewis was answering him. So it led to him being confused and getting frustrated with the questions.
And it would have been better practice for Commander Minor to clarify that confusion instead of going off the record.
Who went off the record?
Well, we just say, do you agree that it would have been better practice to clarify any confusion?
I don't believe that that is Commander Minor's job. It's the investigator's job to clarify any type of confusion.
Okay. So it's your testimony that it's not the witness's job to affirmatively clear that up for the investigator?
If he's not understanding the question that's being asked of him, how,
Okay, so the fault is on the asker.
I believe so.
You talked about better practice being scheduling a witness interview and not doing it before a vacation. You remember that?
Yes.
Okay. You also asked some questions about the delay between the time that the incident happened and the time that Internal Affairs was working. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. You understand that had Sergeant Lewis waited to interview Commander Minor until he was back from vacation, that would have resulted in an additional minimum of 2 weeks. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
You mentioned that scheduling an interview can allow the witness time to gather his thoughts before he comes in to talk. Is that correct? Whether or not a witness has time to gather their thoughts doesn't change their obligation to act with integrity as defined by policies, does it not? And I asked it in a confusing way.
Yeah, I don't really want to answer no one, but I think we understand each other.
Okay. So just for the record, if someone is surprised and just called in by Internal Affairs, and they haven't had time to gather their thoughts, their obligations are the same.
Their obligation is to be truthful in that investigation.
So if someone hasn't had time to plan or consider whatever story they would like to tell, is immaterial to their obligations, correct? It sounded like you were mentioning when we were talking about Sergeant Lewis and buttoning things up, that you were talking about it would have been better if Lewis had just asked Commander Minor about Commander Minor, Lieutenant Bonnet about Lieutenant Bonnet, if he had asked, Lieutenant Smith about Lieutenant Smith. Do you believe that would have been a better practice?
Yes, because I don't think that, if there's 15 people in a room, I don't know who was offended by a comment that was made. I can only tell you if I was offended by the comment that was made.
So that was a weird question that Sergeant Lewis asked?
Yes.
Honestly, we have 3 minutes, and I know the vice chair wants to add something. Just go ahead, so
I'll ask one more.
60 seconds.
One more. You were asked some questions about how the department would typically handle comments in a meeting about a protected class, and you said, nope, never in your history. My question is, at your ranking position throughout the department, would you be in a position to know how many comments were made, how they were investigated, and did you undertake any systematic review of past history and practice before you came in here to offer that opinion?
If you're asking me if I have any metrics on how many times that's occurred, the answer is no.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Okay, does the vice chair have any follow-ups?
2. Is the Scottsdale Police Department an LGBT-friendly place to work?
I would say yes.
Is it a black-friendly place to work?
I would say yes.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Any follow-up, Mr. Savinovic? About 45 seconds. Any follow-up, Ms. Day?
No, thank you.
Did the witness be excused?
Yes.
Ms. Palopoli, you're excused, but I want to remind, I don't know if you heard, I said yesterday, the rule of exclusion is being applied, which means we ask that witnesses not talk to anyone who might be a witness, and also because this is being sent out by a video, people might talk to you and then take the information you provided to someone who is going to be a witness. So simply, if you could try to refrain from speaking about this until the matter is concluded, which is now going to be Tuesday afternoon, it would certainly be appreciated.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, and thank you very much for coming in.